Hi everyone, we're going to talk about watercolor today. Okay, many people are familiar with watercolor. Watercolor is a non-toxic paint that obviously requires a lot of water. So to get yourself set up for today, you need your watercolor palette. You guys either received this palette with the 3 primary colors, or maybe you have something like this at home that has a lot more colors. But you need the paint palette, brushes. I think I gave you 2 different sizes of brushes. Watercolor brushes are brown-haired, natural bristle brushes. So 2 sizes of brushes. So there's this one and this one. Okay. You need a paper towel, a cup of water, and then another plate is really good to have if you have this palette. And then if you have this palette here, okay, this side of the palette actually acts as your plate. Okay. And then I also have a paper towel if I need that as well. Okay. So when we're talking about watercolor paint, we are talking about our use of water more than our use of the paint, all right? So I'm gonna start with using this watercolor palette because I think a lot of students have this primary color palette. So when we're talking about our use of water, we wanna create puddles. So essentially puddles of color. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get some water and I'm gonna get a blue puddle going. So I'm making a little bit of a puddle over here on my other plate. I'm adding a lot of water and watering down the blue, okay? And then I might go back and get more paint and add more paint to that puddle until I can get a nice opaque and transparent wash of color that I'm happy with. If I want it to be more opaque, I add more pigment to the puddle. I'm gonna go through and add more blue here. If I want it to be more transparent, I add more water to the puddle. Okay, so this is watercolor, working with water. There is going to be 2 techniques that I want you to learn. The first one is wet on wet. The second one is wet on dry. When we're talking about wet on dry, we are talking about making lines and details. When we're talking about wet on wet, we're talking about washes of color and effects in color. Okay, so wet on wet and wet on dry. Wet on wet is good for washes of color and effects in color. Wet on dry is good for making lines and going back and doing details. Okay, so let's talk about wet on wet. First thing I want to do is I want to clean that blue off my brush. So I'm just cleaning the brush in the water here. I'm going to use my paper towel and dry it off a little bit just to make sure it's clean. Okay, now I'm going to take my water for wet on wet. The first thing that you do for wet on wet is wet the paper. So I'm taking my water and I'm putting it directly on the paper. I am not making a puddle on my plate. Wet on wet is wetting the paper first. Okay, then I'm gonna mix my own color that I want over here on my plate. So I'm gonna make green. My 2 colors that we have for green to make green are obviously blue and yellow. Blue and yellow make green. So I'm gonna make a nice green over here. And I'm gonna take this green, and you can see my puddle here. It's kind of soaking into the paper. So this paper is textured because it helps hold the water. So the puddle of water, the wet puddle, is making the paper wet. It's soaking into the paper. And then I'm gonna take wet paint and start to put it in the puddle. Okay. Sometimes if I make too much of a puddle on my paper, what I'll do is I'll take my paper towel. This is called the corner trick. And I take the corner of my paper towel and I basically just put it into the puddle and I start to suck up some of the extra water. That is too much. Okay, like that. And I want to add a little bit more green. into my puddle. Okay, if I want to make like a multicolor area, what I can do is essentially take like, if I wanted to say, make this kind of like gradient from red to green, I can add red into the top here. Notice how I have my puddle on my paper, so I'm just taking the paint and putting it right in to the puddle. Okay, I'm gonna clean my brush off. I'm gonna dry it off a little bit because I have enough water on my paper. And then I'm going to push this around, pushing the water around, working with the water. So now I kind of have this puddle of color that is multicolored, so green and red. Okay. If I want to create a wash, okay, I would make my wet area first on the paper for wet on wet, okay? And then I would take my blue. This is if I was like doing sky or something. Start at the top, more pigment. So really heavy at the top. I'm gonna clean my brush, dry it off, and kind of just drag that paint color down. Get a nice gradient going here. Want a little bit more pigment at the top. Just one way to create a nice wash of color. All right, dry my brush. I have enough water on my paper. So watercolor is all about managing the use of water. Okay, so we have some effects in color, some multicolored areas, and then some washes of color for wet on wet. So wet on wet, reminder, is wetting the paper first and then putting wet paint into it. Okay, wet on dry. For wet on dry, I'm gonna switch brushes. So let's say that these objects, I'm gonna let them completely dry and I wanted to add some lines over top or details over top. They need to be completely dried, okay? So watercolor is also about patience, all right? If you wanna speed up the process, you can use a blow dryer. But some of these puddles right here where it's really, there's a lot of water, those would burst and like spread all over your paper. So keep that in mind. Let it soak in enough and then you can blow dry. All right, to make good lines, what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your little brush. Let's get a puddle going of red. Let's do some red lines. Over here, getting a puddle going. You want for lines, you want your puddle to be more concentrated with pigment, so more opaque, okay? Not too much water. All right, and then I want you to practice just making some thin lines today. Okay, so this is a concentrated area of color here on my plate, this puddle. So it's nice and opaque red, all right? Let's make some purple lines. So what two colors make purple? We have blue. I can just mix these two together. And red, make purple. Okay, you can, with wet on dry, putting just wet paper on, or wet paint on the dry paper. And I'm making dots. Okay, and you can essentially just draw with your paintbrush for wet on dry to make any sort of details. Okay, so review. For watercolor, watercolor is all about managing the amount of water and paint that you're mixing together, okay? If your watercolor paint is looking too dark and not transparent enough, you add more water. If you want it to be more opaque, you add more pigment to your puddles. For wet on wet, you make the puddle on your paper. You take clean water and you make a puddle and then you add color to it. You can create color effects by mixing colors or create washes of color from dark to light. For wet on dry, you can take an opaque puddle of pigment from your plate and make nice clean lines with wet paint on dry paper. You can also go over things and to create details, but make sure that your first layer of paint, whether that's a wash or some sort of effect, is totally dry. You want to either wait for it to soak into the paper and blow dry it, or if you think it looks, totally air dried and it's totally good, you can make those details over it, okay? But if I were to draw a line over this wash of color right now, it's going to bleed. It's not going to give me a nice line. So keep that in mind. Dry between layers. Make sure you're drying. Okay, let's practice these techniques today. Washes of color. and making lines and doing details. And let's play with mixing colors on a plate and playing with our watercolor. Okay, let me know if you guys have any questions.